Something happened to you today that you did not notice happening. You saw something. A post, a conversation, a piece of news about someone you know, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted in you. Not dramatically, not in a way you would report to anyone. A small souring. A barely perceptible drop. The specific quality of a morning that was fine a moment ago and is slightly less fine now. And then, almost immediately, you produce the correct response. The genuine warmth, the sincere congratulations, the appropriate celebration of someone else's good thing. And you moved on. What you moved through in that fraction of a second, what you covered over so quickly and so completely, that by the time the correct response arrived you had almost convinced yourself the first thing never happened, is the most honest signal your psyche produces. And you have been burying it your entire life. Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens to the things we bury. He observed that nothing suppressed simply dissolves. It relocates. It moves out of the light of conscious awareness and into a region he called the shadow, where it does not weaken but consolidates, gaining a strange kind of authority precisely because no one is watching it, and from there it begins to govern, not through dramatic outbursts, through preference, aversion, the small daily decisions that feel like personality and are actually residue. What you refuse to look at does not become smaller, it becomes the architect. This video is about the specific mechanism by which comparison, the thing you do 100 times a day without registering that you are doing it, has been quietly constructing the floor beneath your confidence, and about what becomes available when you finally understand what the mechanism is actually measuring. To understand why comparison does what it does, you have to understand how a sense of self is actually constructed. Not the philosophical version of this question. The practical, developmental, deeply inconvenient version. Almost nothing you understand about your own worth came from direct observation. It came from position. You were ranked in classrooms, sorted into reading groups, praised in proportion to how you performed against the child sitting beside you. You learned that you were intelligent because others were less so. You learned that you were kind because someone in the room was crueler. Every quality you currently claim as yours has a comparison buried inside it, invisible and load-bearing. This is not an accident of your particular upbringing. It is the operating logic of nearly every environment human beings build, and it produces a specific consequence that almost no one traces back to its origin. A self that cannot stand on its own. Because it was never constructed to. It was built as a relationship. It requires other people, the way a shadow requires a wall. And when the wall moves, the whole shape distorts. Which is why your confidence has always been weather rather than climate. You have noticed this. The way a single conversation can restore you or dismantle you. The way you can leave the house feeling substantial and return home hollowed out by nothing more than someone else's good news. You have blamed this on sensitivity, on mood, on not having achieved enough yet. You have told yourself that once the next thing is accomplished, the ground will finally hold. It will not hold. Not because you have not achieved enough, but because the ground you are standing on was never yours to begin with. The mechanism has a specific logic that reveals itself when you examine who you actually compare yourself to. Because you do not compare yourself to everyone. You compare yourself to a very specific and very small population. People whose lives are close enough to yours that the difference feels like a verdict. A billionaire does not disturb you. A stranger in another country living an entirely different life does not occupy your thoughts. But the person you started with, who had your disadvantages and your beginning, and who is now visibly further along, that person can occupy your mind for weeks. Proximity is what makes comparison feel lethal, which means the people best positioned to affect your confidence are, almost without exception, the people you are closest to. Not your enemies, your peers, your friends, the ones who are supposed to be beside you, whose lives you know in enough detail to run the calculation accurately. This is why success in your social circle produces a reaction you cannot always admit to. The reaction arrives before the goodwill does. There is a gap, sometimes half a second, sometimes longer, between hearing the news and producing the correct response. In that gap, something honest happens, and you have trained yourself to move through it so fast that you have never examined what lives there. Jung would have told you to go into the gap, not around it, Because the content of that half second is not a moral failure, it is information. It is the most direct signal you will ever receive about what you actually want, delivered by a part of the psyche that has no interest in your reputation. The envy, because that is what it is, however quickly you covered it, is a compass. Its needle is pointing at your own unlived life. You have spent years covering the compass with your hand, and then wondering why you feel lost. Now watch the mechanism run in the other direction. Because it also runs downward, and this is the part almost nobody examines honestly. There are people whose struggles quietly reassure you. You would never phrase it that way. But there is someone whose life is more chaotic than yours, whose decisions seem consistently worse, whose situation is more precarious. And something in you settles when you think about them. You call it concern. You may even genuinely feel concern. But underneath the concern, there is a stabilizing function, and it operates on a simple exchange. Their disorder confirms your order. That is the arrangement you have never named. Some of your relationships are load-bearing in a way that requires the other person to stay exactly where they are. And when they begin to improve, when the person whose struggles were providing you with a reliable sense of comparative position starts moving in a better direction, you will feel something that resembles loss. You will explain it to yourself as worry about their choices, or doubt about whether the change will last, or a sense that they have become different, distant, not quite themselves. What has actually changed is that a mirror you were using to measure yourself has moved, and the reading has shifted. And you preferred the old reading. Jung called this projection, and the word has been so thoroughly diluted in popular usage that it now means almost nothing. What he meant was precise. He meant that the psyche cannot tolerate holding certain contents about itself, so it externalizes them, places them onto a suitable carrier in the environment, and then reacts to them as though they came from outside. The reaction feels entirely justified because the emotion is real. Only the location is wrong. So the ambition you disowned appears as the friend who is trying too hard. The desire for recognition you buried appears as the colleague who is arrogant. The self-regard you were punished for as a child appears as everyone who seems too pleased with themselves. Each of these judgments feels like discernment. Each one is a piece of yourself you have set down somewhere in the room, and are now walking around irritated by its presence. You are surrounded by your own disowned material and calling it other people. There is a social cost to living this way that accumulates so gradually, most people never connect the symptom to the cause. Comparison makes genuine intimacy structurally impossible, not difficult, impossible, because intimacy requires that you show someone your actual position, and comparison converts every relationship into a ranking. No one shows their true position to a person who is scoring them. So you learn to present a version, slightly better than the truth in the areas that feel exposed, slightly worse in the areas where you sense the other person needs to feel superior. You calibrate constantly, and the calibration is so fine that you no longer experience it as dishonesty. You experience it as tact. While the other person is doing exactly the same thing from the other direction, with the same fluency and the same lack of awareness. Which means the conversation you are having is not between two people. It is between two carefully maintained positions negotiating a temporary agreement about relative standing. This is why you can spend an entire evening with someone and go home feeling more alone than when you arrived. Jung wrote about the persona as the functional interface between the private self and the public world. There is nothing inherently pathological about having one. The pathology begins when identification sets in, when the interface is no longer something you use, but something you believe you are, and comparison is what welds it into place. Because every act of measuring yourself against another person is an act of maintaining the persona. You are checking whether the presented version is holding, whether the performance is landing, whether the position you claimed is still defensible. Do that 10,000 times, and the layer stops being removable. It fuses. And then something quietly alarming happens. You lose the ability to answer a simple question about yourself without reference to someone else. Ask yourself what you are good at. Notice that the answer arrives as a comparison. Better than most. Not as good as her. Above average. Somewhere in the middle. Try to answer without the ranking, and you will find yourself standing in front of a strange blankness, as though the question had no content. That blankness is not humility. It is the discovery that a load-bearing part of your identity was never actually inside you. You have been renting your sense of self, and the rent is due every single day. This is what exhausts people who cannot understand why rest does not restore them. The fatigue is not from work, it is from maintenance, from the continuous unconscious labor of holding a position in a field of other positions, all of them moving, none of them stable, requiring constant recalculation, and the field has expanded beyond anything the human psyche was built to process. For most of human history, a person compared themselves to perhaps 150 others, all of whom they knew in full context, including their failures, their bad years, their private disappointments. The comparison was crude but honest, because you saw the whole life. Now you compare yourself to thousands of people, and you see only their outputs, their announcements, the moments they selected, the versions of themselves they chose to make visible. You are measuring your interior against other people's exteriors, and calling the result an accurate assessment of your worth. No system produces a good outcome from corrupted input. Yours has been running on corrupted input for years, and it has produced exactly what you would expect: a chronic, quiet sense of being behind, without any clear idea of what you are behind on, or who set the schedule, or what the destination was supposed to be. Here is where the question becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because if you removed the comparison entirely, if you stripped out every ranking and every measurement and every reference point, you would be left with a question you have been using other people to avoid. Not how am I doing? Who am I? Sit with that question and notice how quickly the mind moves to escape it. It will offer you a resume, a list of roles, accomplishments, relationships, things you would say at a dinner party when someone asks what you do. Every item on that list is a position relative to other people. Notice that. The mind, asked to produce a self, produced a ranking, because it has nothing else in the file. Jung called the deeper work individuation, and it is a colder process than the word suggests. It is not self-improvement. It is not becoming a better version of anything, because better is a comparative. And comparatives are precisely what dissolve in this work. Individuation is the slow separation of what is actually yours from what was installed by an environment that needed you to be a certain shape. It requires taking your identity apart while you are still living inside it, which is why so few people begin it, and fewer complete it. The first thing you find when you begin this work is not a hidden greatness. It is the size of the debt. You will start to see how much of what you call preference was inherited, the career chosen because it read as successful to people whose approval you stopped needing years ago. The ambitions that never once produced a feeling of genuine desire, only a feeling of obligation, which you mistook for drive because they arrived with the same urgency. You will trace one after another back to a source, and the source will almost never be you. Most people are executing a plan they never wrote. On behalf of an audience that stopped watching a long time ago, this is the threshold, and it is genuinely disorienting, because there is no way to unsee it. Once you have watched your own motivations resolve into other people's expectations, you cannot return to experiencing them as spontaneous. You will feel the borrowedness of your own wanting, and for a period, sometimes a long one, you will want nothing. This is not depression, though it is easily mistaken for it. It is what happens when the external scaffolding is removed and the internal structure has not yet formed. Jung understood this interval and did not soften it. He believed that the psyche, when it withdraws energy from the constructed self, produces a barrenness that feels like loss, because in a functional sense, something is ending. The old organizing principle has lost its authority, and the new one has not yet arrived. Most people cannot tolerate this interval, so they refill it immediately. They find a new comparison, a new metric, a new group whose approval they can chase, and the machinery starts again with fresh fuel. This is why so many transformations fail, not because the person lacked commitment, but because the emptiness in the middle was unbearable, and they reached for something to measure themselves against before the interior had time to speak. The silence you cannot fill is exactly the silence in which the self becomes audible. What emerges when the silence is finally held long enough is not what people expect. They anticipate finding something impressive down there, some suppressed brilliance waiting for permission to surface, some hidden version of themselves that is larger and more capable than the one that has been performing for the audience. What they actually find is smaller than that, and stranger, and considerably more valuable. A set of preferences that make no sense to anyone else, an odd attention that keeps returning to unremarkable things, a sense of what matters that cannot be justified in any language the outside world respects. You have met yours before. Briefly. Usually as a child, there was a period before the ranking began when you were absorbed in something for no reason at all, no audience, no comparison, no sense of whether you were good at it relative to anyone else, just the thing itself, and the strange completeness of being inside it. You remember this as play and dismiss it as childish, which is precisely how the psyche buries what it cannot defend. That was not play. That was the last time you were operating from your own center, before the environment taught you that operating from your own center was insufficient, that you needed to situate yourself relative to others in order to know whether your center was worth standing in. Now the frame rotates, and everything you have been calling a flaw begins to look different. The comparison was never simply arrogance or insecurity. It was orientation. A person who does not know where they are will use any available landmark, and other people are the most available landmarks there are. You were not being vain when you scanned the room and calculated your position. You were navigating without instruments, using the only method anyone ever taught you, and doing it well enough to survive environments that genuinely did rank you, where your position genuinely did determine what was available to you. The mechanism was not a defect. It was intelligence applied to the wrong problem for too long. And the envy, which you have been ashamed of since you were old enough to recognize it, turns out to be the most honest thing in your psychological inventory. It never lied to you. It never told you to want what you did not want. Every time it appeared with precision, pointing at a specific life you had ruled out for yourself, usually for reasons you cannot now reconstruct. You did not have an envy problem. You had a listening problem. The envy was trying to tell you something, and you kept apologizing for the messenger, rather than reading the message. Jung's insight about the shadow was never that it should be conquered. That is the popular distortion. The idea that you go into the interior, find the uncomfortable material, and defeat it. He meant something harder and far less heroic, that the material must be integrated, which means acknowledged, held, and permitted to inform you without governing you, not eliminated. Employed, the parts of yourself you exiled did not become weaker in exile. They became unaccountable. The ambition you disowned went underground and returned as chronic dissatisfaction with people who are trying. The desire to be seen went underground and returned as contempt for anyone who shows it openly. The self-regard you were punished for at 7 years old went underground and returned as the reflex that shrinks your own achievements before anyone else can. Each of these is a functional capacity, buried alive, still running, still spending your energy, no longer reachable by your conscious will. Integration is not a moral act. It is a recovery of resources. Here is what nobody tells you about confidence. The word has been so thoroughly corrupted by the people who sell it that it has become almost meaningless. In its popular form, confidence is presented as a feeling of superiority that has finally stabilized. The endpoint of a successful comparison. The emotional experience of coming out ahead consistently enough that the outcome can finally be trusted. This version of confidence is comparison dependent. It requires the mechanism to keep running. It requires a continuous supply of favorable readings to sustain itself. And the moment the readings shift, the moment someone more capable arrives, or the field changes, or the comparison group expands, it collapses. Because it was never grounded in anything internal, it was grounded in position, and position is always relative, always contingent, always at the mercy of what the people beside you happen to be doing. Genuine confidence, the kind that holds in different rooms, with different people, under different pressures, is something else entirely. Jung described it not as a feeling, but as a condition, the condition of a psyche that has stopped submitting its worth for external verification. Not because it has concluded that its worth is beyond question, but because it has stopped recognizing any external authority as competent to rule on the question. That sounds like arrogance to people who have never experienced it. It is closer to indifference, though not the cold kind. A specific quiet that arrives when the measuring device has been switched off, not because the device was destroyed, but because its readings have finally been understood for what they always were. Instruments calibrated for a world that no longer exists, producing readings that were never accurate assessments of worth. Only accurate assessments of position, and position was never the thing that needed assessing. You will recognize a person who has genuinely stopped comparing by a specific absence in how they move through social environments. Nothing in the room changes their size. They are not larger with subordinates and smaller with authorities. They do not inflate in one context and deflate in another. Their proportions hold, and this holding is so unusual that most people cannot identify what they are perceiving. They call it presence, charisma, being comfortable in their own skin, none of which describes the actual mechanism. The mechanism is that the background calculation has stopped running, the continuous unconscious assessment of where I stand relative to everyone else in this room, which consumes an enormous amount of cognitive and emotional energy in people who are still comparison dependent, is simply no longer occurring. And what returns when it has been off long enough is the capacity to be genuinely interested in the people around you, not interested in what they confirm or threaten about your position, interested in them, in what they are actually saying, in what their experience actually is, in the particular quality of their thinking or their humor or their difficulty, without any part of you running the calculation in the background, without any part of you subtracting their success from your account or adding their failure to your balance. This quality of attention, genuinely undivided, genuinely present, genuinely about the person rather than about what they represent, is what most people spend their whole lives performing rather than actually providing. Because the actual thing requires the calculation to stop. And stopping the calculation requires something most people are not yet willing to pay. What returns when the comparison stops is the capacity to want something for its own sake, to choose work because the work itself pulls, not because of where it places you relative to anyone else. To be interested in things that will never impress anyone, which is the only reliable evidence that the interest is actually yours. Most people discover, when they first begin to approach this territory, that they have very little practice distinguishing between genuine desire and comparative desire, between wanting something because it calls to them and wanting something because having it would place them in a more favorable position. The two feel identical from the inside. They arrive with the same urgency, the same sense of significance, the same feeling that this matters. But they have completely different structures underneath. Genuine desire does not depend on others having less. It does not weaken when someone else succeeds in the same direction. It does not require the accomplishment to be visible to sustain itself. It persists in private. It persists when no one is watching. It persists when the person doing it is the worst at it rather than the best. Comparative desire collapses in all of these conditions. Because comparative desire was never about the thing. It was about the position the thing provides. And once the position is secured or becomes unavailable, the desire evaporates. Learning to distinguish between these two is one of the most practically significant things a person can do. Because your life takes the shape of what you consistently move toward. And if what you have been moving toward was position rather than genuine desire, the life you build will have the shape of someone else's idea of a good life. Worn smoothly enough through repetition that it eventually stopped feeling borrowed. There is a final honesty required here, and it is not comfortable. You will not stop comparing entirely, not permanently, not in the way the phrase implies. The mechanism is older than your personality and older than your culture. It was installed by hundreds of thousands of years of living in small groups, where position determined access to resources, protection, belonging. You cannot delete it. What you can do is something different and more specific. You can stop believing what it tells you. The difference between those two things is the whole of the work, because the comparison will still arrive. You will still scan the room. You will still feel the small drop when someone announces something you wanted. What changes is that a witness now exists inside you who recognizes the arrival for what it is. Not truth, not an accurate assessment of your worth or your progress or your right to take up space. Just an old instrument, calibrated for a world that no longer exists, producing a reading you are free to notice and set down. Behavior that is seen clearly loses its authority. It does not lose its presence. And this is where the transformation narratives fail the people who need them most. They promise a threshold, a moment after which the old patterns release their grip and you stand on the far side, finished. That moment does not come. What comes instead is a permanent condition of attention, a lifelong practice of catching the mechanism in the act. Some days you will catch it immediately. Some days you will not catch it for a week. There will be seasons of your life when the whole structure returns intact, when you find yourself measuring again with the full sincerity of someone who has never questioned it. And you will feel like you have lost everything you understood. You have not. The witness does not disappear. It only goes quiet. And it comes back. There is a cost to stopping that should be stated plainly rather than softened. When you stop comparing, you also stop receiving the small daily consolation that comparison provides. The reassurance of being ahead of someone, the pleasant weight of being the more capable person in a particular room, the comfort of a favorable reading. That consolation was cheap and hollow, but it was constant, and its absence is felt as a kind of exposure. You will have nothing to hold on to except the thing itself, the work with no ranking attached to it, the life with no external verification that it is the right one, the private, unwitnessed knowledge that you are doing what is yours to do, which no one will confirm, and which offers none of the warmth that approval offers. Most people would rather be measured than be free. Not because they are weak, because solitude, genuine psychological solitude, the condition of a person who is no longer running their sense of self through the reactions of others, is genuinely unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity, in the early stages, feels like loss rather than expansion. The theater goes quiet, and the human psyche, which was not designed for an empty theater, experiences the silence as something having gone wrong, rather than something having been corrected. But the silence does not stay empty. What fills it, slowly and in forms you cannot predict in advance, is the actual content of your own life. The preferences, the genuine curiosities, the things that call to you when no one is watching and no advantage is available. The person you would be if you had never learned that being a person required a position. Jung believed that becoming yourself was less a privilege than an obligation. A pressure the psyche eventually enforces whether you cooperate or not. You will answer it, or you will spend your remaining years as a position rather than a person. Every person you have ever compared yourself to was, in that same moment, comparing themselves to someone else. There is no top of this structure. There is no room where the measuring finally stops, because everyone has finally arrived. You have been competing for a position inside a system that no one is winning, and the only exit was never upward. It was inward, and it was always unguarded. And you have been walking past it every single day. If something in this gave language to something you have been carrying quietly, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been measuring yourself against for the longest time, because naming it is the beginning of setting it down.